Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show, all about movies.
You're listening to the Jan Price Show, and today my guest is author Jeremy Arnold, and we're talking about The Essentials, must-see movies. It's volume 2. Welcome to the show, Jeremy. It's good to have you back.
Thank you, Jan. It's great to be back talking to you.
You too. I'm going to ask you, I don't think we asked this. Jeremy, you were on my show when a year and a half ago or so when we talked about Christmas in the Movies, which is a wonderful book. But I don't think I asked you, what made you become a film historian?
Well, I don't know. I kind of fell into it.
Like many people, right?
I mean, I grew up indoctrinated into a love of classic cinema, thanks to my dad mostly, and studied film in college at Wesleyan University. Made some short films and worked in the industry in different ways at production offices and on sets of films. And eventually I just fell into becoming a freelance writer for different magazines and websites over the years, including Turner Classic Movies. I've been contributing to their website since 2002 or 3. And several years ago when they started their publishing deal for their line of movie books, it was just sort of a natural fit for me to start doing books for them. I've also contributed to other books. But basically just the years and years of doing it, of researching hundreds of movies for TCM and for other places, and coupled with my natural love of old Hollywood films, it just sort of happened. And here I am now writing, with my third book. So
very exciting. The original Essentials came out in 2016, the first volume 1.
Right.
And so what made you decide to write a second volume?
Honestly, the first volume did well enough that TCM and the publisher both were into the idea of doing a second one. I mean, that's, I wanted to do one from the time I finished the first one, but we just sort of had to wait and see. And, these books are, they're Turner Classic. I wrote them, but they're Turner Classic Movie official books. So obviously they have a lot of say, a lot of input into, how their brand is used. And especially these Essentials books, because the Essentials is a program that has been on Turner Classic Movies since 2001. And it's a big part of their branding. And it's a show, if you can call it that they're particularly proud of because it deals with so many of the all-time great classic movies. And they've had a lot of interesting celebrity hosts of the Essentials over the years, including Robert Osborne for 10 years and now Ben Mankiewicz with guest hosts. And so, I think they were rather protective of intellectual property, so to speak. So, the movies in the first book were a sampling of 52 of the roughly 300 movies that have been shown on the Essentials. And this is another 52 of those 300 or so films. So, this is not my list of the 52 best movies ever made, although a lot of these movies would be on that list. It very much represents the show, the TCM show, The Essentials as well.
So for you, what makes a movie essential? Because first of all, I have to just say, the book is beautiful. It's beautifully written. The layout is just so easy to go through, and I do believe it's the essential book for any movie lover, no question about it. But and you go in before each film, after you're reading about each of these movies, and you say why essential. But for you overall, why do you think a movie is essential? Do you have an overall thought about, not necessarily about a specific movie, but just in general, why a particular movie is essential?
Yes, and I think I have to answer that in sort of two ways. The first is that the way Turner defines The Essentials for their show, The Essentials, is a movie that, all serious movie lovers should see if they want to be a little more serious about it than just be a casual fan. Everyone should see not just Casablanca, but, some really good examples of film noir and musicals and have a sort of well-rounded knowledge of the studio era. So, that it's important that that's how they've defined it. I would agree with that, but I think everyone also has their own personal list of essential films that have maybe as much to do with them as with the movies. But I would say that my definition is sort of a combination of the two, which would be a movie that not only stands the test of time and is still, watchable, but really had impact in some some way, in some form. Maybe like Citizen Kane, it really sort of woke people up to different innate types of storytelling and the structure of a film and where you can lead an audience forward and back in time. Maybe it's something that resonated culturally, like say In the Heat of the Night, for example. Maybe, Rashomon is another one that really opened up everyone's brains to new ways of approaching story. Or it could be Top Hat or Swing Time, simply because Astaire and Rogers are two of the most essential movie stars in Hollywood history. And yeah, of course, everyone should have some type of knowledge about what they were about and what made their movies so special and so unique and transcendent in a way. And, when I was doing this book, there are some movies that I do find transcendent, by which I mean when we're watching them, they sort of bring us to another place beyond just the story that's being told on the screen. And, maybe like Vertigo, it's the type of movie that when you watch it, you can't help start to think about your own life and maybe your own, maybe a love that got away or deep yearnings that we have. There's some movies that tap into these kind of private, very human emotions and experiences that we all go through at some point in our lives. And I think those we tend to cherish the most. Or maybe it's just me. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting you said Vertigo, because I saw I was young, but it wasn't when it first came out, but I didn't see it originally in the movie theaters. I'm not that old, but Vertigo is one that when I did see it as a child, I think it played on television. That movie stuck with me. It always had. And interestingly enough, later in life, I developed vertigo. So it's interesting too. I had no idea about Vertigo. And I live in Carmel, California, and part of the movie was filmed here and not too far from here, where the tower is, and everything is not too far from here. So it has that kind of significance to me now as an adult, since it was filmed here. But I thought that's interesting that you just mentioned Vertigo. So why do you think that one is essential? I mean, of course, it's Hitchcock. And I think almost any Hitchcock movie, whether it was a good movie, most of his movies were good, are essential because he's just a brilliant filmmaker, period. And it's a study in filmmaking and in a different genre. And he opened up filmmaking in a different way. But Vertigo, why Vertigo in particular?
Well, I mean, first, for the reason I already said, the way it takes us to other places, that are sort of private, even while we're wrapped up in the story. But beyond that, what I find so brilliant about Vertigo is that it essentially hypnotizes the audience from the first frame of the opening titles, with the great title design by Saul Bass, spiraling shapes, and the music by Bernard Herrmann going into the eye. And it becomes very hypnotic. And that is sort of putting the audience through an experience that is analogous to the experience that the Jimmy Stewart character goes through in the movie. He becomes obsessed with this character played by Kim Novak, and he's sort of hypnotized in a sense by the situation he finds himself in. And the movie really becomes a study of the disintegration of his mind in a way. And it's mind-blowing and trippy because Hitchcock finds ways to use image and sound, color, to create the same kind of effect using filmic tools on the audience. And I don't mean to get too in the weeds or too academic about these things, but I really made an effort to introduce a little of that kind of visual analysis throughout the book, because I really wanted to give readers a sense, if they're not trained in film studies, for example, or haven't really thought about movies in that way, but to maybe inspire them to look at movies really as works of art that are the result of choices made by artists, in particular the director, but all the other artists on the crew as well and the cast, to really create emotional effects and reactions in the audience. Nothing is by chance in Vertigo. Everything is very carefully designed for very specific responses that we have. And, that's why it's a shared experience that we can talk about, because we've all experienced the same reactions at every moment in that film together, or at least 99%, I would say. And that never ceases to be miraculous to me that movies can do that.
I agree. It's interesting because one of the things you just mentioned is sort of each one of these films that you have in this book and have been a part of the essentials you have a visceral reaction to the film. I mean, there's something, the movie stands the test of time, obviously. That doesn't make any difference what generation watches it. Like when we can, you start here in silent film and, in the 1927, you do this chronologically, Sunrise in 1927. And that these movies, no matter what audience is watching them, and I think that's what, I really gathered from what, reading this book, it can speak to generations beyond the era that it was created. And that's what I found really fascinating about this, because so many of the films that are in this book, I absolutely love, and some I haven't seen. I have to say, I've not seen Sunrise, but the majority of them I have on Turner Classic Movies.
Yeah, it's like you just reminded me that, the movies are time machines. They really are. And they bring us back to not only the era in which they were made, but, if they're skillfully made, the era in which they take place, which could be, far in the future, like 2001 or, eons ago in whatever kind of, historic film. So that is, we really journey, and we journey through time in the story itself. So it's always the idea of time and how it is used in the storytelling, and also just how it's innate to our experience of movies at all is always fascinating. And, really skillful filmmakers sometimes make that part of their storytelling. High Noon is, it purports to be told in real time, about 85 minutes. And you can have a movie that's set in less than the time that it really, than the running time, or of course, much, much longer. And I also, in terms of the movies in this book being in chronological order, I especially like that because it's sort of, in its own way, it gives a sense of the progression of Hollywood history. Even the photos, as the photos progress through the book, the look of them, the type of color, the graininess, the poses, the types of scenes that are being depicted, even that gives you a sense of history unfolding over the years in the movies. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. That is interesting. What's also, too, is that what's wonderful about something like this book, it will, people will go, well, first of all, right now, when most of us are still sheltering in place and we're always looking for something new to watch, to go back and revisit these classic movies and to have the insight of, again, that's why we love Turner Classic Movies so much. It's because of the wealth of information we learn through the introductions and then the outro after the film. And that's what enriches our experience of watching these movies. But this book does the same thing. I mean, it's a great, if it's not one that's playing, they obviously are all playing on Turner Classic Movies, but maybe not at a particular time. And so you go to watch this movie now, but you may have seen it at another point in your life. That's why I love movies so much, is that you watch it at a certain period of your life, and then you could go watch the movie 20 years later and having a completely different reaction to it because of the life experiences that you've had in between. And to me, that's what makes a movie great, when you can rewatch it and have a completely different reaction, or sometimes the same reaction. There are certain movies I'll cry no matter whenever I love Gone with the Wind is everybody always asks, what's your favorite movie? And I always have to say Gone with the Wind, because to me, it was just a brilliant, despite everything that's going on now, and the retrospective and looking back at the movie, it is an amazing feat of movie making as far as I'm concerned. And I can watch that movie over and over again and cry every single time at the same places in the movie. That's, to me, makes it long standing, if you can still have that kind of a reaction to the film. Is that something that you feel too when you were putting this together, that those are the kinds of movies that you decided to include in this book?
Absolutely. I mean, to pick the movies in the book, I really wanted to get mostly just a good variety of genres and filmmakers and actors and actresses and so forth. So there'd be as much representation of, the wide breadth of talent that we all love from old Hollywood. And also in terms of the movies from different decades, it pretty much follows the same ratio of the movies that have been on the essentials. So, there are very few from the silent era and from the 70s and 80s because there have been very few of those on the essentials over the years. So, but there are still a sprinkling of those. In terms of experiencing a movie later in life, it's true. There are some films on this list that I hadn't seen in many, many years. And so I had something of the experience of seeing them for the first time in a way. I don't think there were any that I had never seen before, period. Actually, there was one. I'm almost embarrassed to admit, but for some reason, I had never seen One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest.
Oh, interesting.
When it comes to the 30s and 40s movies, yes, I'd seen all those. Every once in a while, there's something from the more modern era. And I do consider the 70s to be a little more modern that has somehow slipped by. So, I mean, needless to say, Cuckoo's Nest is a great achievement. But, I in my own life, I know that there were films I saw as a kid that I thought were the best thing ever. And when I saw them years later, I was embarrassed to have thought so. I can't now think of a good example of one, unfortunately, but I think we've all been there.
Yes.
But for the most part, almost all of these movies are ones that I enjoy just as much now as I did 20, 30, 40 years ago. Laura was one of the first plastic era films that I saw as a kid, and I still just get entranced by it every time.
Yes, and I agree with you. And just bringing that up, one of the movies I wanted to talk to you about was The Ghost of Mrs Muir, also starring the beautiful Jean Tierney. Interestingly enough, at my birthday this year, I rented out a independent movie theater, and we had a cocktail party, and then I show a film, and I do an introduction, a la Turner Classic Movie type introduction.
Yep.
So I go and do the research of the movie, and it's a surprise. I don't tell my guests what we're going to see. I did this a couple years ago, and the movie that I did then was Out of Africa, one of my all-time favorites. And but this one I chose The Ghost of Mrs Muir, and the reason I chose it, one of the main reasons I chose it, is because again it was filmed here. Part of it was filmed here in Pebble Beach in Carmel. And so I had the audience guess, which scenes were filmed here. And so I did my little background research on the film and did an introduction. And one of the things I discovered, there were many things I discovered, but one was that Jean Tierney had broken her foot.
That's right.
Before filming. And so a lot of her scenes were her sitting down when she was filming this, and they had to go back and refilm, some of it later. But that was one of my so when you had this one included, I was really excited because it is one of my favorites, and many people had never seen it before that came to my party, and they were so glad that I had introduced them to this movie because it's just a beautiful film that sort of stands the test of time. A beautiful love story. And the scene, that they talk about in the movie, which is talk about in the book that we all love, is when Rex Harrison's sort of saying goodbye to her. It's just a beautiful, beautiful movie.
Well, yeah,
Go ahead.
To me, this is one of my favorites of all time too, and it's one that I put in the category of transcendent, one that really takes us away to our own private places while we're watching it, because it's a beautiful love story that never becomes saccharine or cloying, and there's a real honesty to it, and it's just so deeply felt without becoming too sugary. And it also, one reason I think it has that effect is that Jean Tierney, she's sort of a feminist. It has a real current of sort of female empowerment to it. All these men are trying to tell her what to do and what not to do. It's set in, around the year 1900, I believe. So it's that era. And she just does what she wants to do. She's like, nonsense. I'm going to buy a house. I'm going to live alone. I'm going to live alone with my daughter. She's a widow, and everyone thinks that she should act a certain way. And it keeps it feeling very modern, but it also, it sort of precludes any sort of stereotypical, woman living for feeling pressured by, like, going along with the societal expectation that she conduct her life in a certain way, including, having to have a man in her life and that being necessarily better than being alone. But if she wants to be independent and be alone, she does it. You just don't see that very often in movies of that era.
I think that the next book should be about women, because many of the movies from the 30s and 40s portray these incredibly strong women, and I think that might be a good book to talk about women in the films and how they were strong back and during those eras, and then after the war, in the 50s, things shifted and changed. Everything. One other movie I really want to talk about that you included, I think it's the only documentary in here, and that's Harlan County, USA. I had the privilege of having Barbara Koppel on my show a few weeks ago talking about her latest documentary, Desert One. And it was interesting to read about what she went through, because it won the Oscar for Best Documentary. Because we only have like a minute or so left. Can you tell me a little bit about I know. We'll have to do another show, Jeremy.
Okay.
Definitely. We'll have to do another one.
Barbara Koppel was, I think, 25 or 26, and she wasn't even going to do a documentary about these coal miners. It was actually about a political campaign, I think, in the same state. And then she heard about this strike and went to Harlan County and became fascinated by it and stayed there for a long time and turned out this amazing piece of cinema verite. No one expected that it would win an Oscar. So it really was thanks to her talent and her passion and drive that she got it made, and that it got the acclaim that it did. And the thing that I love about it is that these people did, not just the miners, but their wives in particular, they become such compelling characters. I mean, as compelling as any scripted film. And, in an era where, now that's not so uncommon in documentaries, but back then it was kind of. Mm-hmm. And, it really, you watch it and it has the feel of a feature, which I mean as a compliment in terms of the story and how involved that we become. The fact that it's all real, makes it even more compelling as we're watching. There's a great antagonist in there, and someone, one of the so-called gun thugs who's trying to break up the strike, and there's a threat of violence. Barbara Koppel herself and her crew had to endure some violence at some moments. So she really took her life into her hands, but she did what she had to do to, steal shots where she had to in courtrooms and so forth. And the movie still plays like such a fresh work of art. It's really an impressive film.
Yeah, in 1976 it came out, and the issues that they're talking about in this movie are still the issues we're talking about today. That's always what's amazing to me too. Yeah. When we look back, we can look at our history through movies and see that many things haven't changed. Oh, Jeremy, it's such a pleasure to have you on the show. I recommend everybody, if you have a movie lover that go get the Essentials Volume 2. The holidays are coming up. It's a great birthday present, anniversary gift. Just a great, great book. Beautiful. Jeremy, I'm going to have you back on the show because there's so much more to talk about, as always.
Anytime, Jen.
It's such a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. You can listen to the show whenever, wherever. And by going to thejanpriceshow.com, where all my shows are archived. You can also listen on the iHeart Podcast Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. And please go to The Jan Price Show on Facebook and like the show, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter at The Jan Price Show. Thank you for listening.
Jan Price talks to the movers and shakers in the film business. The Jan Price Show, all about movies.